Morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which has been arranged by Solihull Safeguarding Adults Board and is being delivered by Cara Donald from RSVP on the subject of how we can support survivors by being trauma responsive. My name's Rachel Swain. I'm the business manager for Solihull Safeguarding Adult Board. And this webinar is part of a series of webinars being delivered by Safeguarding Adult Boards across the West Midlands region. We've got a huge variety of professionals in the meeting this morning, as you've probably seen in the chat. We've got about 100 people on the call, which is absolutely fantastic, and a wide range of knowledge and experience, which is brilliant. So thanks everyone for joining. I think most of you are probably familiar with housekeeping around Teams, but just a reminder, if you can keep yourselves on mute, that helps us with the background noise. If you've got any questions during the session, if you can pop those in the chat. I know a couple of people are struggling with using the chat, so feel free to kind of do the hands up if you can't put things in the chat. But Cara's quite happy to pick up any questions around what she's talking about as we go along. And there'll also be an opportunity at the end for a Q&A. We are recording the session and we'll share the link with you for the recording after the session today. You can also share that with any colleagues who were unable to attend, and we'll also share some information that Cara's put together for you to take away after the session. And we'll be sending out an evaluation form, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on the session today. It helps us with planning future sessions. So I think that's everything. I'll hand over to Cara Donald, who is specialist trainer with RSVP, and she'll be leading the session for us today. So over to you, Cara.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the session today. Thank you so much for joining. As Rachel said, my name's Cara and I work for RSVP. So we're the Rape and Sexual Violence Project, which we're based across Birmingham and Solihull. And we're the specialist sexual violence support services for those regions. And I'm a specialist trainer, so I deliver training for the organisation in a variety of subjects that's all related to supporting survivors, and also around trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practice. So we're doing a bit of a mix of both of those today. We're going to be looking at some of the issues around sexual violence, and also looking at trauma and being kind of trauma responsive. So I was looking in the chat, and it looks like we've got kind of the entire West Midlands region represented today, which is absolutely fantastic. So it's really great to kind of have you all here. I have got the information. So as I said, in terms of support services, we cover Birmingham and Solihull. So there are kind of regional support services that cover the whole, that cover each area. And I've got a list of those which will be available in the handout as well. So you'll know your kind of local specialist support service as well. Okay. So yeah, as Rachel said, I've got my screen set up so that I can see the chat, and also you guys can see the slides. So please feel free to kind of ask questions, make comments in the chat as we go through. I'll be able to kind of keep up with that. I'd ask that while during the kind of main section of the webinar, if you could try and stay on mute and kind of keep any questions that you want to ask vocally towards until the end, and we can do a bit of a Q&A there. Okay. Oh, that clicked already. Sorry. So today's session, we're looking at how we can support survivors by being trauma responsive, and this is the regional webinar for Solihull Safeguarding Adults Board. Before I get started with the content, I think it's really important that we note the prevalence of sexual violence and other forms of interpersonal violence and abuse within our society. We'll be looking at some of the statistics, particularly around sexual violence during this session, but it is extremely prevalent, and the likelihood is that all of us here will either have lived experience of violence, abuse or trauma, or will have very close friends and family who have lived experience. If any of the content is difficult for you and you need to take some time and you need to kind of switch off, then please just make sure you look after yourselves emotionally. This session is being recorded, so if you need to kind of dip out and watch the recording later, then that's absolutely fine. If you need any support following the session, please feel free to either contact myself, you can contact Rachel as well at the Safeguarding Board, or like I said, there will be a list of regional support services if you need some kind of further specialist support. On the other side of that, I think we need to be really mindful today that this is an open webinar and that there's a lot of people and it is also being recorded. So I'd ask you to really kind of limit any specific questions about cases that you might be working or people that you might be working with, just in terms of kind of confidentiality, because we never know who somebody's going to know personally or professionally. So kind of try and keep the questions and comments really quite general, and obviously not using any names or identifiable features of anybody who is a client or service user of yours. Okay. So the aims of our session today, firstly, we're going to be exploring the prevalence of sexual violence, harassment and abuse. We're going to be looking at some of the myths surrounding sexual violence and abuse. We're going to be looking at victim blaming attitudes and language. And so the first kind of half of this session is going to be focused really around kind of sexual violence. We're then going to talk about trauma more widely and going to be looking at the physical and emotional impact of trauma. And we're going to have some time to kind of reflect on the basic principles of trauma-informed approaches and practice. Really kind of understand some of the ways in which we can support survivors in a trauma responsive way. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some of the stuff around the legislation in terms of sexual violence. So our current UK legislation, sorry, I shouldn't say UK, England and Wales legislation is for the main part held within the Sexual Offences Act 2003. So this covers most offences related to sexual violence, including rape, sexual assault, offences against children, and some, but not all, online offences. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. However, when we talk about sexual harassment is generally covered under the Equalities Act 2010. So in terms of the kind of legal breakdown of offences of sexual violence, they're kind of, it's a little bit kind of broken up and it's not quite as comprehensive as perhaps it could be. There's a couple of other things that are going to be changing very soon. So the Domestic Abuse Bill, which has been passed and is going to be coming legislation very soon, also has some specific legislation in relation to sexual violence, which will make a bit of a difference as well in terms of that legal framework. There's also been a couple of more recent changes in terms of the defence for certain acts of sexual violence in that legal context, and also specific laws that have kind of widened that framework of what we consider to be sexual violence. But like I said, I'll kind of come back to that a little bit later on. Excuse me. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the prevalence of sexual violence within the UK particularly, but you know, a lot of these statistics will translate kind of worldwide. There was a report that was released at the beginning of this year from the UN Women's Group looking at sexual harassment in public spaces. And it was there was quite a lot of press coverage. You might have heard about this kind of at the beginning of this year in terms of what they found out within that study. So they identified that 71% of women of all ages in the UK have experienced some form of sexual harassment in public. And public spaces, they're thinking of kind of public transport, on the street, but also, you know, places like any kind of public waiting rooms or restaurants, bars, places of worship, anywhere where it's considered to be kind of a public space, so not within people's homes, basically. As the age of the women goes down, the number of women reporting being subjected to sexual harassment in public goes up. So 86% of 25 to 34-year-olds and 97% of 18 to 24-year-old women had reported that they had experienced some form of sexual harassment in public. There's also some work being done currently around younger girls, so kind of teenage girls between the age of about 13 to 18, looking at their experiences of being subjected to sexual harassment in public. And unfortunately, the figures are very similar, what it's looking like. And certainly a lot of women who talk about their experiences of being subjected to sexual harassment in public can really talk about this starting from about the age of 13, 14. So this particular study was looking at over 18s, but there is some more work being done to look at the prevalence of sexual harassment in kind of for teenage girls. So the next study I'm going to talk through is one again that was released this year by Taylor and Shrive. And this report was called "I Thought It Was Just Part of Life, Understanding the Scale of Violence Committed Against Women in the UK Since Birth." So this was quite an interesting study for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was focused on adult women who responded. So all the respondents were over the age of 18. However, they were asking them questions about their own experiences since birth. It's a very comprehensive look at kind of all forms of male violence against women. So if you work within that sector or similar sectors and you haven't read this report, I would really recommend having a look at it, because it's a really important piece of research, I would say. So within this study, they found that 99.3% of UK women had been subjected to one or more acts of sexual violence since birth. So that's quite a staggering statistic. You know, that is basically all women have been subjected to some form of sexual violence within their lifetime. This survey was, this piece of research was conducted with over 22,000 women in the UK, so it was a pretty hefty sample. And what was quite interesting about this study was that rather than just asking women, have you been subjected to sexual violence or sexual abuse, they really broke down the different kind of types of sexual violence that you could be subjected to and other forms of violence. And a lot of women who responded to this actually contacted the researchers afterwards to say that they were responding thinking, well, I'm going to say no because nothing's happened to me. But then when the behaviours, the abusive or harmful behaviours were broke down, then they found it very much more difficult to say no. So if you ask somebody, have you been abused? That's quite a big question, and there's a lot of very specific connotations around that, and people might not want to see themselves as a victim, or they may not necessarily recognise what has happened to them as being sexual violence or other forms of violence and abuse. But when you break it down and say things like, has a partner or a male in your life ever pushed you, hit you, spat at you, made you feel scared, all of these kinds of things, then women found it much more difficult to say no to everything, and they found that actually they were saying yes to some of them. And so that doesn't mean that prior to this study women weren't being subjected to sexual violence in these numbers. It's just that they weren't potentially given the outlet to actually look at the behaviour that they've been subjected to and see it for what it is, which is harmful and abusive behaviour. So yeah, I'd really recommend having a look at that study. The other thing that this study kind of really reiterated is that there is a gender disparity in terms of perpetrating sexual violence. The majority of perpetrators of sexual violence are men. Within this study, 97% of the perpetrators were male. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is from Mankind, and again, this was commissioned this year. And it was it's again a very interesting study, because they were very specific about the language that they used. So again, they didn't ask about whether men had been sexually assaulted, whether they'd been abused. They asked about their non-consensual sexual experiences, which really is abuse, isn't it? It's abuse or it's violence, and in a lot of instances, these were actually criminal offences as well. But again, there's that kind of connotation that, well, if I've been abused, then that makes me a victim. So I don't kind of see myself that way. But actually, this incident that happened, I didn't really want it to happen, and I wasn't happy about it, and it's had an impact on me. So that's why they use the language non-consensual sexual experiences. And they found that 50% of the respondents selected at least one. They kind of had, again, some examples. and 9% reported that they had been raped, which is very much in line with what we know about male survivors as well. So with all of these more recent studies that have come out, it's shown that sexual violence is much more prevalent than perhaps a lot of people are aware of. We talk about statistics like 1 in 3 women have been subjected to sexual violence. Well, that never really fit well with me or my understanding. And we say kind of 1 in 6 men. Again, that doesn't kind of fit with what we know around survivors. So these kind of more recent studies are really kind of showing the prevalence for what it is, which is much higher and much more significant than I think a lot of people have been aware of. So the last thing we talk through is this last study, which again hasn't been released yet. These were some of the headlines that The Guardian reported on, and it's looking, so there's a huge review being conducted around the processes of the criminal justice system responses to sexual violence. And so it was found that of 52,210 rapes reported to police in England and Wales in 2010, only 843 resulted in a charge or summons, a rate of 1.6%. And I want to be really clear here, this is a charging rate of 1.6%. This isn't a conviction rate of 1.6%. So of that 1.6% that are being charged, you would probably see maybe less than half of that resulting in a conviction, and that may be an overestimation. So these are just the cases that are going forward and somebody is being charged, or there's going to be some kind of outcome for the perpetrator. So I'm going to leave it there a second and just ask if anybody's got any comments or any questions that they'd like to put in the chat, because I think they're quite heavy statistics. So I'm going to take a second just to let you guys kind of absorb and have a read, and just if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So I'm going to give you guys some time to do that, but while I do that, I'm going to move on and just talk about what we mean when we're talking about sexual violence and how we kind of define that term. So the term sexual violence is quite difficult to define. As I've already mentioned, it doesn't cover one particular act or one particular crime. It's a whole range of offences, and also we would include things that aren't necessarily offences or aren't offences yet. An example of this would be where our legal system hasn't caught up with the pace of technology. So there are a number of kind of online or image-based instances of sexual violence that are not covered by our legal framework as of yet. So there's things that have very recently become offences. So for example, things such as what's known as upskirting. That's something that's become a specific offence within the last few years. I think it's 2018 it came into effect. However, there are other things that aren't offences but still that do have a huge impact. So an example of that would be cyber flashing, or what's also known as sending unsolicited dick pics. So which is sending pictures generally of a penis to somebody without their consent. We're seeing a lot more women talking about, and it disproportionately impacts women. We're seeing a lot more women talking about their experiences of being subjected to that and the impact that has. However, at the moment, it's not against the law, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not an act of sexual violence, because what we're seeing is it having an impact. So that's where we come to this idea of a continuum of sexual violence. This was first coined by Liz Kelly in 1988. So it's a very long-standing idea. And she talked about focusing on the impact on the victim rather than the act itself. So there's a couple of reasons why that is beneficial for survivors. Firstly, because it means that we can include things outside of that legal framework. So as I mentioned, there are things that are not offences or not offences yet. And it means that as specialist service providers or as kind of whatever your supporting role, we don't have to be like, oh, actually, we can't work with you because that's not an offence. It means that we can kind of include things outside of that legal framework. The other reason is because it stops this hierarchy of offences. So it stops the idea that what one person has been subjected to is worse than what another person has been subjected to. So, for example, the idea that a contact offence would always be worse than a non-contact offence, or a rape would always be worse than a sexual assault. And if we have that idea, then it means that we kind of start to have a hierarchy of people's pain or people's trauma, and that's not an appropriate way to respond to anybody. So if we look at the impact on the individual rather than the incident itself, then we are making sure we're really working in that kind of person-centered way, and we're acknowledging the impact of all instances of sexual violence. Okay, so there's a couple of things that come in the chat I'm just going to refer to. So Bernice has asked, what are the reasons behind the low rates of charge against a high report rate? There isn't, firstly, I would say there isn't a high reporting rate. There is a low reporting rate already for instances of sexual violence. It's estimated that about 1 in 10 instances of sexual violence are reported to the police. So there's already a low reporting rate for sexual violence. However, the reasons behind low charging rates and conviction rates are they're quite kind of complicated, and I have my views around that and other people have their views around that. I think it's a combination of problems within our legal system and kind of systemic problems with how the criminal justice system responds to survivors, and the whole kind of process not being set up in a way that kind of supports survivors and their lived experience. There's also problems with victim blaming within the criminal justice system, but also within wider society, that discredits and disbelieves survivors as well. And we also have, a lot of problems with male violence against women more generally, which again feed into these areas. So there isn't a straightforward answer to say, it's this particular reason. There's lots of reasons. And that's part of the reason that there is a report and an investigation. They're kind of looking into the process, a review, sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. There's a review being done of the criminal justice process in relation to sexual violence. So Michelle's asked, will you be able to send a link to the survey when you send the slides, please? Yes, I can certainly send the I mean, the surveys are all kind of closed, if that's what you mean, but the reports I'll be able to send links to. That's not a problem. That's Rachel just responding to that. So Joe said, I suggest tougher laws against crimes and most importantly sexual crimes. Yes, that potentially might be an option, but unfortunately if instances of sexual violence are not even being taken to court, then it doesn't matter the outcome or the sentencing for it, because it doesn't get to that point. So we have a lot of work to do in how we respond to survivors as a society and within the criminal justice system before we even think about what the outcome is of sentencing for people who perpetrate sexual violence, because that only works if those cases are going to court. And also there's there's kind of for and against in terms of tougher sentences and whether that actually has an impact. Personally, I would argue that it doesn't. There's wider things that need to be done. Okay.
Just got one person with their hand up as well, Cara.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, I can see the chat, but I can't see the people. But who is Patricia? Yes.
Hi, you mentioned just before sexual assault and rape. What's the difference?
Okay, so rape is a specific crime that is so it's penetration with a penis against somebody's consent, and that could be in any kind of, so that could be vaginally, it could be orally, it could be anally, and a sexual assault is kind of any unwanted contact leading up to that. So anything before a penis has been inserted without somebody's consent. Does that answer your question, Patricia? That would be kind of the difference. So sexual assault covers a huge range of incidences. I also say as well, so rape is a crime that can only be committed by somebody who has a penis. However, there is a crime of assault by penetration, which carries the same sentencing as rape, and that's kind of, that can be any object or fingers or anything that isn't a penis. So that's kind of the distinction between the two. Does that answer your question, Tricia?
It does. And so is sexual violence the terminology that overrides all of that?
Yeah, so sexual violence or sexual violence and abuse is kind of an umbrella term that covers anything where there has been an impact to that individual. So it could be instances of sexual assault, it could be rape, it could also be things such as grooming, any offences against children, it could be any kind of online offences, so posting pictures of somebody without their like sexualized imagery without their consent, or sending rape threats or misogynistic comments that have a sexual nature to people. So there's a kind of huge range. It could go from it's a huge range of incidences that would come under that kind of umbrella term of sexual violence.
Thank you.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is look at some of the most kind of common rape myths that are very prevalent within our society. So I'm going to keep these up here, and I'm going to ask for people to have a look at them. I'm going to go through each of them, but have a look at them and think firstly about whether it's something that you've heard, whether you think it's a myth or whether you think there might be some truth in it. And most importantly, what do you think the impact on survivors might be of some of these rape myths? Okay. So I'm just going to go back to the chat. So Laura said, you hear the term unreliable witness in my experience, and the fact that someone has mental health issues used as one of the reasons, and there needs to be more work on understanding this by the police and the CPS. Yeah, there's quite often, there is work being done within larger police forces about understanding trauma and understanding people's individual responses to trauma. But there's still a long way to go, and there's certainly a problem with police not understanding trauma responses, and that leading to that idea of somebody being an unreliable witness. So, for example, not being able to tell kind of a linear story about what they were subjected to. That can be seen as trying to mislead the police, or as lying, or if their story isn't quite the same every time. But what we know is actually if somebody's been through that kind of traumatic event, that's quite a normal response to that there's bits they might block out, there's bits that are kind of clearer, and so there's ways in which the police can respond more appropriately, and they're becoming more widely used, but there's still a very long way to go with the police's response to that. Okay, so I've got some people saying all myths, so I'm going to talk about the first one. So what about this idea that acts of sexual violence are committed by strangers? What are people's thoughts around that? And what do we think potentially the impact might be? So Tracy said, not true, it can be your husband, family member, friend, etc. Yeah. And Mandy said myth and prevents victims speaking out. Yeah, absolutely. So actually most instances of sexual violence occur between people who are known to each other. It's estimated that it's around 9 out of 10 instances of sexual violence occur between people who are known to each other. And most happen within the context of intimate partner relationships. So it's usually, husband, boyfriend, partner, or family member, friend, work colleague, acquaintance. You're much more likely to be subjected to sexual violence by somebody that you know than by a stranger on the street. The impact of that myth is that sometimes survivors might not recognise it as being sexual violence because they think, well, this is my partner, or my husband, so they can't rape me. That doesn't fit in with my understanding of it being like a stranger on the street, somebody gets dragged into an alley, that kind of imagery. And it means that it can act as a huge barrier to people accessing support and also justice for what they've been subjected to. So the next one, when a person is raped, they will have physical injury. So yeah, I'm just going to look at the chat. So yeah, most people are saying, you know, that for the first myth that that's not true and that it's more likely to be someone you know, and that's actually absolutely the case. Yeah. So what about this idea that when a person is raped, they will have physical injury? Do you think that is always the case? And if it's not, what do we think the impact might be? So Mandy's just said no. That's absolutely right, Mandy. Yeah, it's not the case at all. So if there's not physical injury, then how do you prove that that has happened? So Randip said more mental trauma. Kirsty said no, the impact can be if there's no injuries, I cannot report. Yeah, absolutely. Teresa, this would cause mental distress to the woman. Yeah. Mandy said if there aren't physical injury, then they may think they participated or consented. Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth said internal injuries, maybe. Yeah, but not even always that. Lauren, not always the case. Psychological and emotional impact, lots of trauma and shock from the rape. Absolutely. Deborah said not always the case, and leaves the victim having to prove their experience and then having to have a rape kit, more trauma. Yeah, absolutely. And so the idea that there must be physical injury, again, it leads into this misconception that that isn't, for survivors where that hasn't been the case, then it kind of undermines their experiences and say, okay, well, that wasn't what happened to me, so that can't be a rape. No one's going to believe me. The police aren't going to believe me. My friends aren't going to believe me. My family aren't going to believe me. And it can be extremely isolating. It's also the case that sorry, what was it? That there can be a rape occur with no physical violence. I mean, the act of rape itself obviously is an act of physical violence, but also it may not be that somebody's held down. It may not be that somebody's punched or hurt in that way. If there's coercion or threats used, if the person is incapacitated through drugs or alcohol, if they're asleep, if they freeze, which has just come into the chat there as well, and that's the most common trauma response to being subjected to sexual violence, is to freeze. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on when we talk about trauma. And that's a body's response to keeping you alive in that situation and actually reducing the impacts and the physical impact and level of injury. So it also may be that somebody can't physically fight. Sorry, I'm moving ahead to the next one. But yeah, if somebody doesn't have physical injury, there is a whole host of other things that could have happened around that situation. And when we talk about consent, so the legal definition of consent, this changed in 2005 from victims having to prove that they didn't consent to defendants, to use the legal term, having to prove that they reasonably believed that that person consented. And there's a whole list of things that means that somebody cannot legally consent. If somebody is unconscious or asleep, then they can't physically consent. They can't legally consent, sorry. If there's threats of violence or if they're unable to say no due to concerns about their safety, then they haven't consented. So it's it may not be that somebody has had to be held down, but that doesn't mean that they have consented to what they've been subjected to. Okay, so yeah, quite a lot of people saying the same thing in the chat, and that kind of links to the next one as well. So someone subjected to sexual violence will fight off their attacker. That's not always possible. People have talked about the freeze response. Also, people might not be physically able to do that. They may not have, for any variety of reasons. So I'm going to look at the next two. I'm going to kind of talk about them together. So firstly, this idea that if it was really rape, you would report to the police straight away. What do we think the impact might be on that? Or do you think that you know, if somebody was raped, then well, they would go to the police straight away, and if they don't go to the police straight away, then that can't be what has happened to them? So I'm going to give people a minute just to write in the chat their thoughts around that. And also at the same time, the idea that false accusations of rape and sexual violence happen all the time, and that this undermines real victims. I can see my typo in there, sorry about that. Real victims. So Margaret said there will be shame involved. Oh, sorry, no, you said sorry, Kirsty said first, they need to process it first and understand what's happened as a victim. So not everyone goes to the police straight away. Yeah, absolutely. And some people never do. Some people never report to the police. That doesn't mean that what they were subjected to wasn't sexual violence. Margaret said there will be shame involved, thinking that it might be their fault in some way. Absolutely. Benisa said realization is not always immediate. Yeah, absolutely. The shock or the shame of it all. Rafika said, Berta said, false accusations of rape are often reported on, it's gone up, media or social media, adding to the effect of feelings that victims won't be believed. It's going a lot quicker now, sorry. Yes, there is certainly an over-reporting of what might be considered to be false accusations. I think often there's a misreporting of that as well. Juliet has said myth, feelings of shame and guilt might prevent them from speaking out and may not understand that it was wrong. Yeah. Lauren said not straight away, often want to just go home or somewhere safe, process what's happened, may feel ashamed and self-blame, or that no one would believe them, especially the authorities. If family members or partners may worry about the implications of them being convicted. Oh, sorry, yeah, if the perpetrator is a family member or partner, then yeah, absolutely. Deborah, could we feel of the consequences, wider impact, possible shame and humiliation? Absolutely. So, mistrust of the police with crimes like this, yeah, absolutely. Michelle said multiple reasons they may view themselves at being a greater risk. Yeah. I'm just going to see if there's anything. So yeah, thank you everyone for commenting. A lot of these are very similar. There could be culture involved and chance of being disowned by the family. Yeah, so there's always wider implications as well. Sexual violence doesn't occur within a vacuum. You know, it's not the only thing that's happened or that is happening for that person in their life at that point. So there's a lot of kind of wider complications that can create barriers to people going to the police. And also, it's not the best option for everybody. As we've seen, charging and conviction rates are so low that if there's any risk of further violence, then they may feel actually that going to the police isn't the best option for them. What I would say is that no survivor should ever be pressured to report to the police if they're not happy to do so, because it's a very difficult process. It's a very long process. If people do want to report to the police, they should absolutely be given the support to be able to do that. And I would advise the best thing to do is to get somebody in touch with an independent sexual violence advocate, and they can kind of help them through that process. They do fantastic work in kind of acting as a bit of a buffer between the survivor and what is quite a complex and traumatizing and re-traumatizing legal system. And also around the false accusations. So nobody said that they think that that is the case, which is great, because there is a huge misconception that false accusations of rape and sexual violence happen all the time, and that it's that's one of the problems with the reporting rate. With the conviction rates. It's just not true. It's just not the case. And the impact is that it creates barriers to accessing support and to accessing justice. So all of these rape myths in different ways, the impact that we're seeing is that they discredit and they undermine survivors' experiences, and they cause people to be concerned that they're not going to be believed, and that's a huge barrier for accessing support and accessing services. Okay, so one of the other things we're going to talk through quite quickly is looking at some of the barriers for adults with care and support needs. So again, there's a huge fear of not being believed, and that's something that is pretty universal for most survivors. I'm not going to say every single survivor, because there is nothing that is universal for every single survivor. In the same way, there's nothing that's universal for any single human being on the planet. But there is certainly a huge proportion of survivors of sexual violence who have talked about their fear of not being believed as being a huge barrier for accessing support and talking about their experiences of being subjected to sexual violence. Some of the additional barriers that we might see for adults with care and support needs is, firstly, there may be communication difficulties. It may be if they're non-verbal, or if they struggle with communication, then it may be difficult for them to actually kind of vocalise what they've been subjected to. That might not be possible, and finding a way of communicating that can be difficult. There is also the kind of combination of having to rely on others for hygiene or physical care, which, if they've been subjected to sexual violence, might be something that is quite traumatising for them, or re-traumatising for them, but also is a kind of necessity for their care and support needs. So that can be quite difficult for adults with care and support needs who've been subjected to sexual violence. Also, what we know about sexual violence is that quite often there's a power imbalance within those relationships in terms of the abuser and the victim in that situation, and that is equally as true with adults with care and support needs. They're much more likely to be subjected to sexual violence by somebody that they know, and potentially with somebody who is in a position of power or authority over them, either in terms of their kind of basic needs being met, but also their physical care and support needs, or just more kind of generally in terms of their life. You know, it's somebody's quite likely to have quite a lot of power over them. There's a lack of clarity within the legal system around capacity to consent to sexual relationships. So, as I was talking about earlier, one of the criteria for somebody not legally being able to consent to sexual activity, and therefore consent not being able to be used as a defence if they're subjected to sexual violence, is that if somebody is deemed not to have capacity to consent, then they can't legally consent. But there isn't a clear framework for determining whether or not somebody has capacity to consent, which puts adults with care and support needs at risk of either being in situations where they can't engage in healthy sexual relationships because they're deemed as not having capacity, or puts them at risk of not being believed or action not being taken if they're subjected to sexual violence because they're deemed to not have capacity, or they're deemed to have capacity, sorry, when potentially they don't. So it's a very difficult kind of balancing act in ensuring their autonomy over their own relationships, but also ensuring that they're not subjected to sexual violence, and that the people who are caring for them are doing just that and are not abusing them in any way. So there still isn't a kind of clear definition legally, and at the moment what is used is case law, so it's used on a case-by-case basis. And Laura's just put in there local authority versus JB in 2020. Yeah, so that there isn't a kind of definition. What they do is they treat it on a kind of case-by-case basis in determining whether or not somebody has capacity. But in order for that to happen, it has to get to that point in terms of it actually going to trial. And as we know, our legal system isn't fantastic at making sure that cases of sexual violence go that far. So I'm just going to come back to the chat. Feel free if you have any questions about this particular bit. So Tracy said, I think a lot of people do not realise that whatever they experience is classed as rape. Those in relationships, of course. Well, yeah, those in relationships also kind of wider than that. I mean, yeah, absolutely the case. I think when you know the person who has subjected you to sexual violence, particularly if it's somebody who you love and you care about and who should be protecting you and should be and shouldn't be inflicting harm on you. So, you know, that could be a partner, that could be a friend, it could be your parents, it could be your siblings, it could be other family members. It can be difficult to recognise what you've been subjected to as being sexual violence. So the study I talked about right at the beginning, Taylor and Shrive, one of the other things that came out of that was really interesting, that's very relevant to what you just said, Tracy, is that over half of the women who responded to that survey said that they had woken up and found their partner having sex with them. And if somebody is asleep and you have sex with them, that is rape. But there's a bit of a kind of, people don't always recognise that. If it's somebody that they're sharing a bed with, they think, well, you know, okay, I didn't really want to at that point, but that's not in my head, you know, a stranger dragging me off the street and beating me to a pulp and inflicting, you know, horrific rape on me. That's just something that I wasn't that comfortable with. And that's over half of women in that survey said that that is something that had happened to them. And I found that almost more staggering than any of the other kind of statistics within that report. But also that kind of, that people didn't recognise that that was sexual violence and that was rape. So yeah, it's absolutely the case that people often within relationships might not recognise what they've been subjected to as sexual violence. So yeah, Nick's asked, when is it too late to report historic abuse? So there isn't a, within the UK, I know in America they have this idea of statute of limitations. We don't have that within the UK, so you can report any non-recent abuse, however long ago it was. Obviously, the longer ago it was, there are other complications, such as if the perpetrators died or, well, yeah, if the perpetrators died or your kind of account of it. The likelihood of it going forward, I wouldn't say is any less than any other case, really. And if you have a case of non-recent abuse that somebody wants to report to the police, they should be able to do that. Yeah, I think I've covered everything else in the chat. Okay. So what I'm going to talk through now is the idea of victim blaming. We're going to talk about kind of what it is as a concept, different types of victim blaming, and again, looking at potentially what we think the impact of victim blaming might be on survivors. So victim blaming is an idea that was first kind of talked about, again, like in about the 1970s. When we first started talking about victim blaming, it wasn't really related to sexual violence, but certainly when we talk about victim blaming now, we tend to be relating it to instances of sexual or domestic abuse. And it's the idea that a victim is wholly or partially responsible for what they've been subjected to. And like I said, it's particularly prevalent within instances of sexual violence. And we see victim blaming in lots of different ways. When we question the behaviour, the character of the survivor in that situation. Well, what were you doing? What were you wearing? Why did you do this? Why didn't you do this? We try and kind of rationalise that in some way they must have been to blame for what they were subjected to. Sometimes people do this intentionally, and a lot of the time they do it unintentionally. So the work of Dr. Jessica Taylor, she released a book last year called Why Women Are Blamed for Everything, which is a really comprehensive look at victim blaming of women and girls in the context of sexual violence. So if it's something that interests you, I'd really recommend having a look at her work. But she talks about three kind of categories of victim blaming, and she says that it will fall generally into one of these three categories. So the first is behavioural, so blames the behaviour of the victim as the reason for the sexual violence being perpetrated against them. So She was drinking, she encouraged them by flirting, she was out partying, she was out alone late at night, anything like that, anything to do with her behaviour. She didn't fight back, she didn't scream, all of those kinds of things. The next is characterological, so blames the character or the personality of the victim. So we used to hear things like she's promiscuous, or she's a fallen woman, or she's trying to think another kind of older example, but yeah, we talk about her kind of personality as being kind of promiscuous or a slut or anything like that. However, we have kind of new language for old ideas at the moment, which is where we talk about women being vulnerable or making poor choices, or being easily led as well. A lot of young girls are talked about as being easily led. But what we're doing is we're saying that their character or their personality as being vulnerable or having complex needs is the reason that they were subjected to sexual violence. And that's where we fall into this victim blaming territory. And when we can't find any fault of the behaviour or the character of the victim, then we blame the situation that they got themselves in. They put themselves at risk by being at that particular bar, by jogging late at night. And it's the situation that becomes the reason, but that woman put herself in that situation. So therefore, by proxy, that is also her fault. So all types of victim blaming tend to fall into these three categories. So what I've got now is I've got some kind of statements that I'm going to read out, and I want you to think about whether or not this is victim blaming. If you want to put like a category and say, yes, it's behavioural victim blaming or characterological, I'm happy for you to do that. In what way is it victim blaming, and what might we say as an alternative, or should we say anything as an alternative as well? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is, why didn't you just say no? Do we think that statement is victim blaming, and which category, and what might we say as an alternative, if there's anything to say as an alternative? I'm just going to give it a second. So I'll say it again. So why didn't you just say no? So Margaret said, yes, definitely victim blaming. And why not just ask what happened? Yeah. Kirsty, yes, behavioural. Alternative, were you in a position to say no? Yeah, potentially you could look at the power within that dynamic and actually, were they in a position to say no? Mandy said, yes, it's victim blaming. It suggests you had a choice. Absolutely. Kelly said, places blame and responsibility on the victim. Yes. Nick said, yes, it's behavioural. Yeah, absolutely. So it's putting the emphasis on the victim to say, well, why didn't you stop this from happening? Why didn't you say no? As we've already talked about, there are 100 reasons why somebody might not be able to say no. And even if they did say no, that might not have worked. And Laura said, given the perception that the person is in some way responsible for the actions of the offender, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we have no control over the way that other people behave towards us in that context at all. So that kind of brings me quite nicely onto the next one. By drinking too much, you're putting yourself at risk of being assaulted or raped. Do we think that is victim blaming? I said yes. So repeat, please. Sorry. So by drinking too much, alcohol, you're putting yourself at risk of being sexually assaulted or raped. Do you? Kelly said unable to consent. Yeah. Kirsty said yes, that someone shouldn't have to think about what they are or where they are or what they're doing. Mandy said yes, being drunk doesn't give anyone the right to abuse. Absolutely. Benisa said yes, because people drink for many reasons and it's not an invitation for sexual activities. Yeah, absolutely. So again, there's an idea that if somebody drinks too much alcohol, they're putting themselves at risk. And there are risks to drinking too much alcohol. There's risks that you could fall over. There's risks that you could be sick. There's risks that you could make a bit of a fool of yourself. And there's certainly kind of risks in that sense. There's risks in your bubble in terms of what you can control. So if you are intoxicated and you fall over, that is that's kind of within your bubble. But if somebody else subjects you to sexual violence, then whatever you have been doing doesn't increase or decrease that risk. They have made that choice to do that to you. And there isn't anything in your behaviour that is increasing or decreasing that risk. So Berta said risk is different to blaming. It should be, but unfortunately, we live in a society, and certainly in terms of a lot of the sectors that you guys work for and that I've worked in previously, thinking about being risk averse or managing risk often comes with a whole heap of victim blaming. And that's not intentional of individual practitioners. Quite often it's a systems issue. But we look at somebody as being vulnerable. Okay, so the next statement I've got, this person is vulnerable and this increases their risk of sexual exploitation. So this is a good example about something that is used a lot, this idea that somebody being vulnerable increases their risk of sexual exploitation. Okay, what are people's thoughts about that before I give a bit of an explanation about the kind of difference between risk and blaming? I'll just give it a second. So I'm going to say it one more time. So this person is vulnerable and this increases their risk of being subjected this increases their risk of sexual exploitation. What do people think about that? Hi, Joita. Yes, you will get the link to the recording. Okay, thanks. Benisa said definitely victim blaming, as their vulnerability opens them up to opportunists. Yeah. Rachel definitely hear this a lot, yeah. Increased risk if the perpetrator purposely preys on those who are vulnerable. Kelly, I'll come back to that in a second, Deborah, sorry. Being vulnerable means you're at increased risk of a lot of things. Matthew said, Sally, this statement is true. Kirsty said, this does not give someone an excuse or a right to exploit them. So the reason I include this statement, okay, because Matthew, I would disagree with you that that's true. Okay, I really would. What we're saying in this statement is that this person being vulnerable, right, increases their risk of being subjected to sexual exploitation. So we could take vulnerability in lots of different ways. People talk about women, particularly women, being vulnerable in lots of different ways. It could be that they're homeless. It could be that they have drug or alcohol problems. It could be that they're being subjected to domestic abuse. It could be that they are considered to have mental health concerns. There's lots of different ways in which people are considered to be vulnerable. Okay, none of those things increase that individual's chance of being subjected to sexual exploitation on their own. None of those things do. Okay, what increases the risk of somebody being subjected to sexual exploitation or any kind of sexual abuse is their proximity to a perpetrator. So by suggesting that their vulnerability and their situation is what's increasing the risk, we're saying it's their fault because they are in that situation. They are vulnerable because of their, and it may not be, we may not be saying that they're vulnerable because of their own choices, although often that is the case. That's what people say. But what we're saying is that it is their fault that they've been subjected to sexual exploitation or sexual abuse because they were vulnerable. And this is where we come to, again, this characterological victim blaming. There's something wrong with you that means that other people are taking advantage of you. Michelle said, we all face situational vulnerabilities, and so behaviours in men need to change, not women's choice of clothing, drink or social activity. Absolutely. And that's where it comes back down to, isn't it? All of these things we've talked about, we're talking about victims' behaviour, we're talking about victims' character, we're talking about the situations that the victims find themselves in. But what's missing from that conversation about blame? What's missing from that conversation? Exactly. Kirsty said it, the perpetrator, the person who is actually to blame for what they've been subjected to. Yeah. So also there's this kind of idea that that perpetrators kind of prey on vulnerable victims. But actually what we've talked about throughout is that the people that we're most at risk from are people that we know and people that we have relationships with. So the idea that kind of being vulnerable in other situations, so drinking too much alcohol or being homeless or whatever that might be, actually you're much more at risk if you got a lift home from a male friend or partner. And that's not to say that we should, you know, be thinking about kind of risk all the time in that situation. I'm not trying to kind of catastrophize that in any way, but it's to say that the victim isn't in any way in control of what has happened in that situation. And by suggesting that they are in any way to blame suggests that they have some level of control over that and they should have done something differently. Whereas what we're ignoring is the behaviour of people who think it's okay to subject people to sexual violence. And that's where our focus needs to be when we have any conversation about blame. So Kelly said, multiple vulnerabilities means increased risk, not their fault. Yeah, for example, 34% of CSE victims are looked after children who are viewed as vulnerable by their safeguarding status. Yeah, that is one way of looking at it. I would disagree with that. I think as well, somebody's already said vulnerable is used a lot as a term. It's become quite a kind of, it's so I'm going to, so Kelly, in terms of the kind of increased vulnerability, there and safeguarding, there's a kind, yeah, there are things that are increased in terms of someone's risk because of things that are happening around them. Okay, but we shouldn't be trying to change that about a person to reduce their risk of sexual exploitation or sexual violence. We should be doing that because that's going to help that person. So, for example, children in the care system often have a lot of trauma, a lot of violence and abuse happening around them. We should be supporting them with that, but not in an idea that it's going to increase or decrease, but it's going to decrease their risk of sexual exploitation. The two they don't go hand in hand. That's my point that I'm making. Matthew said, I do not think it is victim blaming to identify someone who is vulnerable is at more risk of abuse. Can you explain further? I'm going to kind of be repeating myself. Somebody's right. If we take the example of somebody who we consider to be vulnerable, they don't have control over the way that somebody else behaves towards them. Okay, none of us do. And so it's nothing about their vulnerabilities that increases their risk of being subjected to sexual exploitation or sexual abuse in any way. By having that focus of, and if we use the example of, say, alcohol use, then if we have a teenage girl who has been raped at a party and she was intoxicated at the time, okay, and she's with a group of other girls that we would consider to be vulnerable, and so what we do with them is we talk to them about alcohol use and about risk and about how if they stop drinking so much alcohol they won't be subjected to sexual violence. Okay, and we put it in that nice neat little box and we say, okay, we need to change their behavior because their behavior is the problem, because if they didn't get so drunk then they wouldn't have been raped. But that in no way is going to decrease their risk of being subjected to sexual violence, okay? And the focus is completely off. So identifying somebody as vulnerable and that being a kind of characteristic of theirs, and that being related to their risk of sexual violence, is victim blaming. I don't really have another way of kind of putting that, I'm afraid. And if you don't agree with me, you don't agree with me. I would recommend, like I said, I'd recommend having a look at Jessica Taylor's work, and other people who talk about victim blaming. Laura Collins has said, I think it's important to recognise vulnerability but not attach a label to someone. That's a really good point, actually, and that's another way of looking at it, is that we can look about disadvantage. We can look at disadvantage and oppression that's kind of happening around people to say that, you know, somebody is experiencing multiple disadvantages and that's going to have an impact, because that's not looking at them or their behaviour. That's looking at the things around them to say, well, actually, this person is homeless and they're living in poverty, or they have additional kind of support needs. We're looking more at the things around them rather than labelling them as being the problem. And that's where we come into that kind of victim blaming territory. Michelle said, is anyone invulnerable? Well, yeah, exactly. I don't regard myself as vulnerable in any way, but I have found myself in vulnerable situations while travelling alone. Should women stop doing what they want because men are not sufficiently challenged to change their behaviours? I would absolutely agree with everything you just said there, Michelle. So Berta said, I don't think we can get away from the fact that adults who have care and support needs are more at risk of abuse, hence why we raise a safeguarding concern and find ways to reduce the risk. Yeah, I feel like I'm just going to be repeating myself. Kathleen said, I think the concept of power and imbalances in power is a more useful lens. Yeah, so again, that's looking at you know, the kind of systems around somebody. So rather than looking at the individual behaviour, we're looking at those kind of complexities around somebody. As I've already said, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, all these things occur with other systems around in place. I'm going to kind of tie that up now, just because I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I think this discussion could go on for most of the session, so I'm going to kind of bring it back. I'm happy to kind of go back to it a bit more at the end if people still have some questions around it. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on now is looking at the next section, which we're going to be talking about trauma and trauma-informed practice. Okay, so first and foremost, I want you to think about what is trauma. So I want to think of any examples of things that you would consider to be traumatic events, and if you're happy to write them in the chat, that would be great. So Kelly said ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, yeah. Teresa, war. Mandy, death of a parent. Beneath, death. Kelly said domestic abuse, parental mental health. Yeah, I'm just going to give it a second to see if there's any more coming through. Deborah said loss of loved one to suicide. Yeah, any kind of bereavement or loss of a loved one could be considered to be a traumatic event. Kirsty, I'm going to come back to that one in a second. Mandy said living with addiction. Amy said an illness. Yeah. Kelly said parental breakdown of a relationship could be, yeah. Any form of, oh, they're coming in really quickly, being in care, end of a significant relationship, terrorism or a terrorist attack, yeah. So there's lots of different examples. I'm going to let them kind of carry on coming in. So there's lots of different examples of things that might be considered to be traumatic events. So yeah, witnessing domestic abuse, illness or injury, yeah, loss of a child. So there's lots of different things that we might consider to be traumatic events. Anything that where people have had kind of a significant, where it's had a significant impact on somebody. But it's not actually the event itself that determines whether or not something is traumatic. So all of those things that we've talked about, that you've kind of listed in there, could be considered to be traumatic events. But it's not the event that defines whether or not something is a trauma. It's a person's physical and emotional response to that. Okay, so when we experience a trauma or a loss or any kind of really significant event within our own lives, and this is our determination of what's significant, okay, so it doesn't have to be what everybody else considers to be significant, be our understanding of being significant, we can have a response to it that is overwhelming. So this is where we get that kind of idea of trauma, that at that moment, that experience is too much and our systems become overwhelmed. So we tend to respond with our trauma responses. So our active responses are fight, flight and friend, and our passive responses are freeze and flop. So this is where our systems become overwhelmed and we tend to limit the way in which we respond to that situation. Okay, so fight or flight responses and friend responses are can be displayed in lots of different ways, including running, hitting, biting, scratching, hiding. All of those would be considered to be kind of active responses. And then we see these passive trauma responses, which we've already talked about and people have mentioned. Freeze. There's also flop as well. So freeze is going very tense and being unable to move, and flop is similar, but it's almost kind of that last line of defense and your body just goes completely limp like a kind of rag doll. When we're talking about sexual violence, the most common response to being subjected to sexual violence is to freeze or to flop. So you're more likely to go to a passive response, not exclusively, but it is the most common response that's reported by survivors. So one of the most important kind of developments in trauma theory is the recognition that responses to trauma are normal reactions to overwhelming experiences. Okay, so the way people respond is normal. It's a normal human response. They're not mad, they're not bad, there's nothing wrong with them, they don't need to be fixed. They are showing normal responses to overwhelming experiences. Okay. So what we see with trauma is that people will have a physical and an emotional response. So they will have some kind of one of those responses that I've just talked about in terms of fight, flight, friend, or freeze or flop. A traumatic event could be anything that's a threat to life, to body, integrity, or to sanity. And also it can be a threat or a perceived threat. Okay, so we can respond in the same way, and it can be a threat to ourselves or it can be witnessing a threat to somebody else. So somebody mentioned in the chat witnessing domestic abuse, but also witnessing an accident or being a first responder. That can also cause the same responses. The other thing that we do know about trauma that has this kind of significant difference between what we'd consider to be a traumatic event and just kind of a bad life experience is the lasting impact. There's some debate or disagreement from different practitioners and different kind of areas as to whether there is a neurological change. So some people say that trauma causes changes to our neural pathways, to our brain, and that's why it has a lasting impact. Some people say that it changes our worldview, it changes our feelings of safety and connection, and it's that emotional impact that has a lasting impact. I am not in any way enough of an expert in this area to know which is right. I'm not a neuroscientist in any way. I kind of think it doesn't matter from our perspective as to whether it's changed somebody's brain or whether they're having an ongoing emotional impact. The outcome is the same, that this has had a lasting impact on that person. So when we're responding to people who experience trauma, that's what we need to know. We kind of don't really need to know the ins and outs of it. We need to know that it's had a lasting impact. And certainly people report a change of worldview. Things that were safe are no longer safe. People who were safe are no longer safe. And that's what we see in terms of that real world impact. And again, I'll just reiterate that what we're seeing are normal reactions to overwhelming experiences. So when we talk about the basic principles of trauma-informed approaches, there's lots of different areas that we need to consider. So first and foremost would be the physical space. So understanding that trauma is an experience that people feel physically as well as emotionally, and that the physical space can have an impact. Emotional safety, so ensuring that people feel safe and regulated when they're with us and how we can kind of facilitate that. Looking at coping mechanisms and not attaching any judgment around coping mechanisms. Through empowerment, through voice and choice of service users and clients who we come into contact with. Building positive relationships and recognising the importance of cultural difference and identity. So those are some of the basic kind of principles of trauma-informed approaches. What I'd like to do now is actually spend a bit of time kind of reflecting on each of those. Okay, so the first thing I'd like you to do, and if this is going to be too much for you, then please don't feel that you have to kind of engage in this at all. Like, you can just take a minute and listen to the outcome. If you feel able to, and if you're in a place where you feel safe enough to be able to, I want you to think of a time when you have felt uncomfortable or overwhelmed by the physical space. So think about, firstly, where were you when that happened? What did it smell like? What did it feel like? What was it about the space that was overwhelming? Do you know what it is, or are you not sure? What were your physical sensations? Were you hot? Were you cold? Were you finding it hard to breathe or to feel safe? What was it about that situation that made you feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed in that physical space? So I'm going to give it a minute or so for people to have a think, and I'm hoping you don't have to share, absolutely don't have to share in the chat if you're not happy to. It would be great if a couple of people did feel happy to be able to do that, but like I said, only if you're comfortable in doing that. And if I don't get any responses, then I'll kind of share my own experiences. But it'd be great to get a couple of other people's as well, if anybody feels happy to share. Thank you, Bernice. So sitting on the London Underground train late at night with only a few people on the train and feeling isolated. So that's really interesting, isn't it? That your situation there was that actually there wasn't a lot of people around, because I think a lot of people with the physical space might say being on a really packed train might be quite overwhelming for them. But I absolutely get what you mean, that feeling that there is only a few people and feeling quite isolated, that can be quite overwhelming as well. So it can kind of be one extreme or the other. I'm just kind of different with the Underground, that I absolutely have had experiences where I've been on the Underground in the summer. I always seem to go to London in the summer, and it being absolutely packed and it being too hot, and that kind of being quite overwhelming for me. So Kirsty said, someone getting in my personal space. I'm very closed person and people that I don't know, but for people I trust, they can be in your zone. Yeah, I'm absolutely the same. My personal space boundary is probably about here for most people. Like, I don't like people in my space, but then, for example, my children completely ignore that, and they're usually about here, which I don't mind that so much. There are times when I don't like that either, to be fair. Rachel said, when there were a lot of people, felt like too many and felt very hot and a bit panicky. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rachel. Deborah said, could not re-enter space, smell, visual flashbacks, heart racing, had to leave. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Deborah. So actually that can be a barrier for people actually accessing a physical space, you know, and it may be something about that physical environment. It might be something about their own situation as they kind of arrive there. So Tracy said it all starts to look the same. There is a look in the eye of someone right before they're about to do something. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Tracy. It sounds like it's a kind of very specific experience. I was studying at uni in a classroom that was empty, and on a part that was not busy, a person walked in and gave me a look that gave me chills, and he locked the door. I'm really sorry to hear that, Tracy. That would be a really kind of scary situation. I can see that. Paige said, got locked out of a hotel at 4 a.m. in the morning in Birmingham city centre and was told by the receptionist to sort out getting home as the rape rate in the area was very high. Wow, that's a helpful thing to tell you at that point. I'm sorry about that. Phone dead, only dodgy looking cars and men about, went into panic mode. Yeah, so I don't want people to like I said, go into too much if it's going to bring up things that are going to be difficult for them. But if you want to think about those physical sensations, so kind of a couple of people have mentioned them. Rachel talked about feeling very hot and a bit panicky. Bernice talked about feeling isolated. So those kind of physical sensations of kind of being in that panic mode, what do they feel like? what do they feel like for each of you? If anyone's happy to kind of share that. So I'm just going to give it a minute. So Jodie said sick, throat starts to feel a bit like it's closing. Yeah, Deborah said real, overwhelming. Yeah, absolutely. So what we have here, even from just a few examples, is we have very different situations in which people felt overwhelmed. So for some people, it was being in places where there's too many people, it's too busy, there's too much going on, that's overwhelming. For other people, it was being isolated and being in places where they felt unsafe because actually there wasn't very many people. For some people, there were specific situations which were really scary and which were where they felt that they were at risk. So that, again, is that kind that can feel that kind of threat response of, you know, I feel like I'm at risk here. And then also people have talked about different sensations. So some people might be too hot, they might be too cold. Sarah said heart racing or pounding. Benisa said induced panicky feeling that something negative might happen. Amy said tight chest. Samantha said can't think straight. Yeah, absolutely. Teresa said gut feeling. Michelle said physiological heart racing, dilated pupils, clenched fist. Yeah. Tracy said shock, became extremely calm, and while my mind is leaving the situation to focus. And Kirsty said automatic thoughts to be negative. Yeah, so those are all different responses that people have had to a situation where they felt uncomfortable or overwhelmed in the physical space or by the physical space. So why is it important that we think about the physical space? Because it can have an impact, and all of these different things can have an impact. So for some people, it might be noise, it might be too loud, it might be overwhelming, there might be music, it might be too quiet. I'm a city girl, I've lived in Birmingham pretty much my whole life, and I'm used to a lot of noise. And if I'm in places that are really, really quiet, I feel a bit panicky. I'm like, where's the noise? I need some noise. And in the same, if it's too dark as well, I'm used to light pollution, I'm used to street lights. If I'm on like a country lane and it's you know late and there's no noise, you can't hear anything, that's where I start to feel really panicky. Put me in Birmingham city centre on a Saturday night and I'd feel absolutely fine, but yeah, I if there's not enough noise or there's not enough going on, then I feel quite panicky. So it's very different, and that is partly to do with context. That's to do with what I'm used to what feels safe for me. So understanding the impact of the physical space, so it could be noise, it could be smell. Is it unpleasant? Is it strong? And there may be things that are related to people's trauma. So, for example, some people really struggle going to clinical environments because of that very distinctive smell that a lot of hospitals and doctors and dentists and things like that have as well. Its sites, could there be things that are strong colours? Could it be triggering pictures? Could there be too much? Could it be overwhelming that there's too much to look at, there's too much going on? Or in the same way, not enough for some people. There's also the impact of touch, you know, particularly if you work in any kind of environment where you might be doing physical examination. So if you are a health professional or if you're somebody who provides personal care and you need to physically touch the person that you're supporting in whatever way, then that can also have an impact. You know, think about the room. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? That kind of thing. Taste, particularly if there's an oral examination. So if you're a dentist or whatever that might be. And also physical safety. Is that person safe in that environment? You would hope so if they were in an environment where they're seeing somebody who's supporting them. But do they feel physically safe in that environment? That's a very different question. So we can know that somebody's safe in a particular environment, but that doesn't always translate to them feeling safe within that environment. And it could be due to any of those things that I've just talked about. So it's not to say that we can change the physical environment for everybody who walks through our door, because that's not possible. We're not ever going to produce a room or a building or a place that is completely trigger free for everybody in the world, because it's not possible. Because as we've already seen, what makes people feel comfortable or uncomfortable or overwhelmed is not the same. So what we need to do is understand that the physical environment has an impact. There's things we can do to try and minimize the impact, but recognizing that it has an impact, and if somebody does become overwhelmed, that it could be to do with the physical environment, and that's a conversation that we can have with them. Okay, so the next bit I want to move on to is around emotional safety. So again, if you're happy to have a think about this, if it's too much or you don't want to get involved in this, absolutely fine. What makes you feel safe in your relationships? And again, you can share examples if you want to. They can be your own, or they can be kind of more generalized ones as well if you want to. But what is it about, what are the aspects of a relationship that make you feel safe? And if people are happy to kind of write in the chat, I think I just realised I didn't say that, so if you could write in the chat, that would be great. So Amy said trust. Yeah, trust is a big one for a lot of people. Yeah, Emily said trust as well. Kirsty, trust, consistency, the feeling of being safe physically and mentally. Yeah. Honesty, respect, understanding, positive communication. Yeah. Trust and respect, consistency. So what we're seeing here is actually quite a lot of the same things coming through. So Benita said laughing, yeah. Respect and trust, joint working, fun and laughter, equality, positivity, trust, respect. So what we're seeing a lot here is trust. That seems to be a huge thing for a lot of people to feel safe within a relationship. They need to feel that they can trust the person in that relationship. Okay. Another thing that's coming through quite a lot is about connection. And people are saying this in different ways. So they're saying kind of humour and laughter, or equality, partnership. So feeling a kind of connection with that person. So those are things that are really, really important within our relationships, certainly within our personal relationships. However, I think these also translate into our working relationships as well, in terms of what makes us feel safe in relationships is what we need to be able to deliver when we're working in a relationship-based way. So when we're working with service users and clients who have been subjected to trauma, these things are going to be really, really important. Trust, positive relationships are really important. Connection is really important. So the three things I'm kind of going to draw out here around trust, connection, and compassion. So people need to be able to trust you, to feel that they can be safe with you. That's a huge part of it. They need to feel connected, and you need to treat them with compassion. So I'm just going to talk through this from Brene Brown. So Brene Brown is a fantastic woman who has loads of really fantastic resources around things like building trust and connection, being empathetic rather than sympathetic. She's also got loads of books as well. She does a lot of research around shame as well, so she's got some really fantastic resources. If you haven't heard of her, I'm sure a lot of you will have done. If you haven't heard of her, I'd really recommend having a look at some of her stuff. So she talks about building trust and connections in terms of braving. So we're actually going to use that word vulnerability that we were kind of talking about earlier. She talks about vulnerability in a very different way. She talks about it from a kind of a way of our own vulnerabilities and kind of putting ourselves out there and being vulnerable. So almost in a kind of more kind of classic sense of the word than we talk about other people's vulnerabilities. And that comes with this idea of braving and how we build trust and connection. So first and foremost is around boundaries. And this isn't about professional boundaries. This isn't about us maintaining our boundaries, although that is important. It's about respecting other people's boundaries as well, which I think is something that often gets overstepped. So we have a lot of training, a lot of information about professional boundaries and how important it is that we remain professional within relationships. Obviously, it's very important, but I also think it's equally as important that we empower people to be able to protect their own boundaries within those working relationships as well, and that sometimes gets overlooked. So it's, you know, respecting a person's boundaries and also being clear about what your expectations are of them and what they can expect from you, and being reliable with that. So that moves to the next one. So if you say you're going to do something, then you should be able to do it. But also, you know, we're all human beings and we make mistakes. So being able to kind of own that as well is really important. So yeah, reliability, being consistent, and a lot of you have said within what you want from a relationship, that consistency is really important. The next is accountability. So like I said, we all make mistakes. Owning those mistakes, apologizing and making amends is really important. We shouldn't always have to be the professional within that relationship. We are human and we're a person within that relationship. And we're just as likely to make mistakes as the person that we're supporting, and we need to take ownership of that. Excuse me. The next is the vault. So that's around kind of confidentiality and not sharing things that don't need to be shared with other agencies or other professionals, and really allowing people autonomy over their own stories as well. So not expecting people to tell us things in order to be able to support them. I really think that people should be able to have autonomy over their own stories, and that we can work with somebody who is struggling with their responses to trauma without needing to know the full history of their trauma. We can work with those responses, and we can work with helping them to kind of manage their own kind of day-to-day lives without having to get them to sit down and tell us every awful thing that's ever happened to them. So knowing when we need information because we need it, and when it's actually just that expectation that somebody tells us everything, is really important as well. Next is integrity. So choosing courage over comfort. You know, do what's right for that individual. Non-judgment, and in all areas, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, but really not having any judgment around people accessing the services. And again, that's something that's kind of bandied about, and it's like, what does that really mean? And I'll explain a little bit more about what I really mean by non-judgmental in a second. And generosity, so giving that person time and space, engage with that person sat in front of them, taking on their views and really listening to what it is that they want or need at that point. Okay, so what I'd like to look at now is this idea of coping mechanisms. And again, I'm going to kind of put this back on you guys and ask you to think about your own coping mechanisms. So what do you do when you're stressed out, overwhelmed, upset, or angry? And remember, you don't have to think about this if you don't want to. That's absolutely fine. But if you're able to, and you think, actually, think a little bit about how I cope with different situations, if you're happy to share, that's great as well. So I want you to think about how you cope. Okay. So Julia said reflective writing. Jodie said you shut down. That's very honest of you, Jodie. I think actually a lot of people do that, and I've certainly done that myself in the past. Kirsty, music is my go-to. Paige has said sleep. Emily, go for a run. Amy, take time out, exercise for stress relief. Riza said watch TV. Sandy said garden. Great, okay. Deborah's also said potter in my garden. Yeah, a lot of people. Amy, eat. Yes, that's one of mine. Pam, exercise and music. Beverly said talk it through with my partner. Amy, try to offload and then move away from it so it's not weighed down. Okay, that's good. So kind of talking to other people in that sense. Juliet's walk my dog. Mandy, read books. Bernice, initially I might feel resentful and panicked, then time gives me time to think about it. So you know, there's always going to be times when we feel overwhelmed or we feel stressed out, and that's just, again, that's just part of being human, isn't it? And that isn't something that we should ever be ashamed of, because that, you know, we all have situations where that's the case. Deborah said, and the not so positive one, on some occasions drink too much. Thank you for sharing that, Deborah, and I want to come back to that in 1 second. Des said move away from for a bit, so yeah, I'm kind of moving away from the situation. So Deborah said in there that it's not such a positive coping mechanism to drink too much, and I think people kind of would probably agree with that, and I think we might be going into another area where there may be a bit of disagreement with what I'm going to say, which is fine. I want you to think now, and I want you to write in the chat. These don't have to be your own now. These are just general ideas around coping mechanisms. So I want you to think about what are considered to be healthy coping mechanisms and what are considered to be unhealthy coping mechanisms. Okay. So Imogen and Nick were saying about their own, so sleep, time and space. Imogen was saying try and chill, relax by doing something I enjoy. Yeah. So what we've got here actually is quite a lot of people have shared things that will probably be considered to be healthy coping mechanisms. So listening to music, sleeping, okay, great. We've got some coming in now. So Neelam said healthy, speaking to others about the situation, unhealthy, trying to block the situation. Deborah said unhealthy, eating, drinking, substance use denial. Healthy, Amy said healthy, sleep, rest, talking things through, exercise. Unhealthy, not talking about it, talk it through. Unhealthy, keep it bottled up inside. Mindfulness or exercise, drugs or alcohol. Yeah. So what we have as a society is we have this idea of what is considered to be healthy coping mechanisms and what are considered to be unhealthy coping mechanisms. And things like yoga, mindfulness, exercise, talking about your feelings, all of those kinds of things are considered to be healthy coping mechanisms, and drugs and alcohol and self-harm and ignoring problems are unhealthy coping mechanisms. I would really encourage you to kind of get rid of that idea about healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, because what is happening for that person at that time is meeting a need. So what they're using to cope, whether that's yoga, whether that's alcohol, is meeting a need for that person at that time. Okay. So that's not to say if somebody said to you, you know, I'm drinking really problematically, I want some help. Absolutely, we should be able to support them with that. What I mean by that is that if somebody is that we shouldn't make assumptions about people's coping mechanisms, and this is where we come to that real idea of non-judgmental attitudes, is that we shouldn't ever make assumptions about somebody else's coping mechanisms and saying, okay, that is the problem, or even that is part of the problem. Okay, we shouldn't ever be like, okay, that person's drinking too much alcohol and that's the problem, so we're going to take away that alcohol and then they'll be all better. Or even something like somebody, because there's also coping mechanisms that are kind of, for one person might be healthy and for another person might be unhealthy. So eating is a good example. You know, if somebody is a coping mechanism is actually, you know what I do, I cook myself a really nice meal and I sit down and I give myself some time, people will be like, oh yeah, that's a really good way of dealing with that. If another person said, I sit and eat 2 tubs of ice cream followed by 3 chocolate bars, may or may not be a personal experience, then that's not a good coping mechanism, because that's going to have a huge impact on you going forward. So eating kind of for one person might be healthy and for another might be not. And then again, so for example, if somebody overworking as well is something that we don't kind of consider to be an unhealthy coping mechanism, but for some people it can have a detrimental impact on other areas of their lives, which seems to be how we kind of define unhealthy coping mechanisms. Same with exercise. You know, for one person, that's, if they're doing it excessively, then it could be having a detrimental impact on other parts of their lives. So there's no kind of really succinct list of this is good and this is bad. And if we start putting things into those lists, then we start putting judgment on it. So that's what I'm really trying to say, is kind of moving away from any kind of judgment attached to people's coping mechanisms, and recognising that that is meeting a need for that person at that time. And if that coping mechanism is having a detrimental impact on that person and they want support with it, then the first thing we should be looking at is what need is being met by that person. Kirsty said it's about educating the person as to why they are not great for their health or well-being. Yeah, I mean, you can do that, but I think a lot of people know that drinking too much alcohol isn't good for them. People know smoking isn't good for them. People know that taking heroin isn't good for them. It's not always about education. I think for some people it may be, and they may not be aware of the impact, but I still wouldn't make the assumption that that's what it is. You know, people do things that are harmful to themselves, like a lot of the time, and quite often it's meeting a need for that person at that time. Another example of this would be, some people have talked about you know, talking about your problems as being healthy and not talking about your problems as being unhealthy. And again, that might be the case for some people, that actually they need to be able to talk about it. For other people, actually talking about what they've been subjected to is re-traumatizing, and talking therapies don't work. Counsellors do absolutely fantastic work, and for a lot of people it's really beneficial, but not for everybody. But we have this assumption that that's how people heal, that's how people get better, is through going to counselling. But actually for some people that process is too difficult and too overwhelming, and so being able to contain and kind of compartmentalise things is a way that they are managing. And if they start unpacking all of that stuff, they may not ever be able to get that lid back on, and that might have a more detrimental impact. So it has to be down to the choice of the individual as to what they feel is most beneficial for them at that point, is kind of where I'm going with this. I'm happy to go with kind of any questions around any of that. But what we see is that firstly, all behaviour is communication. So
can I ask, what's your opinion on some of the programmes that we do are about recognising certain situations and what to do when it happens, like domestic violence and things like that? So the onus is on us almost having a faulty switch, that we're drawn towards that particular type of scenario. So not to say that the programmes aren't good, but if we're looking at it from a point of view of meeting the need, oftentimes it's about trying to avoid the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is not actually, what's the word? Nothing's done to stop them being perpetrators unless they've been caught, as it were.
Yeah, so I don't quite understand what your question is, but I agree with you that that certainly we focus too much on the behaviour of victims in any situation, reducing their own risk, and certainly that translates into domestic abuse as much as it does with sexual violence. And that actually we maybe should focus much more on the emotional and physical well-being of women in those situations, rather than trying to educate them to prevent them getting into further abusive relationships. I think we can do a lot more work supporting women with what they've been subjected to, rather than them looking for signs and red flags and that kind of thing. Is that kind of what you mean? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Because I think yes. Yeah, because it's almost like there's still that element of blame.
Yeah.
And so if you do this program, you'll be okay, you'll be fixed, and therefore you'll have no more problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with you about that, Patricia. I think that there's this, again, it's this idea that we have around sexual violence and domestic abuse, that women need to change their behaviour in order to prevent them being subjected to it, and we completely ignore the fact that mainly it's men's behaviour that is the problem. And it's like the idea of kind of, you know, having like self-defense classes to protect you, and that kind of thing. It's like, well, why do I need to change what I'm doing? Why do I need to be able to protect myself, when actually we should be looking at all the other kind of wider problems as to why people think that's acceptable. So I'm just going to go back to the chat quickly. So Joe said, I've been trained in a PTSD trauma therapy technique which doesn't discuss the events but deals with what they now feel about themselves, the world, safety. Yeah, that sounds absolutely brilliant, Joe. Like, and it's not to say that we shouldn't give anybody the space to be able to talk about what they've been subjected to, but what I'm saying is that for some people, that space is not what they need. And the problem with thinking that that's what everybody needs is if that doesn't work for that person and they think, actually, you know what, counselling therapy has just made me feel worse, and I was promised I was going to be all better. No one needs to be made all better because they're not broken. But I was told I was going to be all better and now I'm not. So there must be something wrong with me. Sandy said there are female perpetrators and male victims, and we need to be aware of. Yes, I did talk about male survivors at the beginning. I identified a study around that as well. There are female perpetrators, but they are significantly smaller in numbers. And when we talk about the wider problems of sexual violence, generally we are talking, unfortunately, about male perpetrators in that context. So we do need to focus that conversation. Absolutely, there needs to be a space for male survivors. As an organisation, we support male survivors. We have our male survivors accreditation. Most of the men subjected to sexual violence are subjected to sexual violence by other men as well. So when we're talking about perpetrators, we do need to have that conversation about men's behaviour, unfortunately. Okay, so yeah, just to sum up what I was talking about coping mechanisms. So as I said, all behaviour is communication. All coping mechanisms serve a purpose for that person at that time. So if we attach judgment to it, then we're kind of almost attaching judgment to that person. And we need to kind of look at the need that's being met at that point. The other thing as well is that if we can understand our own coping mechanisms, and within that relationship, particularly if we can understand our own coping mechanisms, that can also help within that relationship as well, and recognise sometimes when we might be bringing stuff in that isn't actually anything to do with that person. And so kind of that self-reflection is really, really important when we look at that kind of trauma-informed practice. Okay, so our responsibilities within the relationship. Empowerment is really important. Offering as much choice as possible to service users and clients is so important, and offering them a voice. So you're going to be able to do that through, you're going to be able to offer people choices by listening to them and offering them a voice. You really should be putting that at the centre of the work that you do. Building positive relationships is our responsibility. It's not the responsibility of other people to engage with us, okay? Nobody should be labelled as hard to engage. If somebody is hard to engage, it's probably that they don't feel safe within that relationship or within that service. And we need to think about what we can do to help them to feel safe, to facilitate those feelings of safety within that relationship. Cultural difference and identity is also really important. It could be that that's directly related to the trauma. For example, people who've been subjected to racism, homophobia, or other forms of disadvantage or discrimination, or prejudice. It may have impacts on their feelings of safety. So, for example, we've been talking a lot about sexual violence. It may be that women don't feel safe with male workers, and we need to recognise that. And there's lots of other examples. That's just one example I'm using there. Acknowledging and also acknowledging our privilege within that relationship as the professional first and foremost, because we're the professional within that relationship, but also other areas of privilege that we might have around our gender, around our sexuality, around our race or ethnicity, around our ability or disability, is really important. So acknowledging that will help to redress the power imbalance within the relationship, and kind of doing whatever you can to redress that power imbalance, which comes back to that voice and choice that I was talking about at the start of this section. So how do we put all this together? So acknowledging the impact of the physical space, building relationships through trust, connection, and empathy, offering surface users voice and choice, understanding the role of all coping mechanisms, understanding our responsibilities in building positive relationships, and recognising and responding to cultural difference and identity. In terms of how we support survivors, first and foremost, we need to believe, you know, if somebody discloses sexual violence to you or any form of interpersonal violence and abuse, you should believe what they're saying. Listen, allow people space to tell you what they need to tell you, not to imply any blame, acknowledge the impact of the sexual violence or any kind of trauma, and offer choice as much as possible. So offer them choices. And it doesn't have to be big choices. You know, it can be as simple as, do you want me to call you or text you? Would you like to sit in this chair or this chair? And kind of from that initial point, because that means that people then have some autonomy, firstly over the physical space, over that communication, all of those things, and that's going to help with that kind of empowerment. Okay. I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I'm gonna kind of run through this quite quickly because I want to have a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, if you want to start putting them in the chat, just general questions, then I'll kind of come to them and just once I've finished off with the content. Okay. So last thing I'm going to talk through is the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is kind of where people feel safe and regulated. This is our happy place, I suppose. Shock, trauma, and overwhelm narrow that window of tolerance, and connection and empathy kind of widen that window of tolerance. So if somebody is in an active trauma response, so if they're triggered by something either within the environment or within themselves, then they can start to tip into that kind of dysregulation. And this is where people might become agitated or overwhelmed. They're kind of starting to feel overwhelmed with that situation. And then we will see either kind of hyper or hypo arousal. And this will display like wildly differently in every individual. So, but what we're seeing there is a kind of active trauma response. So hyper arousal is people in that fight or flight mode. So people might be agitated, they might be pacing, they might be aggressive, they might be shouting, they might be hiding. There's lots of different ways in which somebody can display hyperarousal in that sense. But what they will be having is a physical and an emotional response to what is happening around them. And then we see hypoarousal, which is the other end of that, which is where people go into that kind of disassociative state. So that disconnect from reality and feeling overwhelmed is that kind of shut down response. Okay. And whenever anybody is going into these kinds of responses, what we need to do is try and kind of bring people back into those feelings of safety, into that window of tolerance. So I'm going to give some suggestions, and these are also things that work really well, even if somebody isn't in a kind of active trauma response. They can also help to kind of facilitate feelings of safety by tapping into people's emotional and physical responses. Okay. So there's different kind of grounding techniques. First is called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this is a technique that's kind of getting you to identify things around the space to kind of bring you back into that present moment. So you think of 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. I like this one because it kind of taps into all the senses. So if somebody doesn't know what their trigger is, hopefully it will kind of help to identify that. The other example of things are things that can be kind of more physical. So this idea of that is called a bottom-up approach. So if somebody is feeling overwhelmed, there's a physical response to that. And if they can't think straight, for want of a better term, if they're feeling overwhelmed, they can't really think straight, then sometimes those verbal techniques aren't going to work so well. So what you want to do is tap into those physical responses, because if you can tap into the physiology of it, then that will come up into that person's emotional response as well. So you start with the physical response, and that helps with the emotional response. So breathing exercises are one way of doing that. Breathing exercises can be really, really beneficial in that situation. But you can also do other kind of physical responses. So tapping and drumming's another really good example. And there's the butterfly hug as well, which is kind of tapping on either side. There's some really good YouTube videos of kind of showing you how to do that and different ways of doing that. The other thing that can help people is a soothe, calm or emergency box. These are called different things with different in different places. But the idea is that people almost put together kind of themselves something that will help them to regulate if they're feeling overwhelmed. And there's lots of different things that people can use. It can be sensory stuff. It can be like fidget spinners and toys, like those poppers are really great for some people. If you see, I don't know if any of you have primary school age children, you've probably seen them. They're like bubble wrap, but it's like continuous. My kids have got absolutely loads of them. But also things like fidget spinners, any kind of good kind of aromatherapy oils, anything like that. But also you can have in there things like lists of emergency contacts with a script of what you want to say. So one of the things that has been mentioned when people are feeling overwhelmed is that you can't quite kind of get your mind to work in the way that potentially you want to. So you might not be able to think about what you actually want to say to somebody if you're trying to reach out for that support. So writing that down at a time when you're feeling calm and regulated can also help that person, if they can have a script to say, okay, if I'm feeling like this is who I call and this is what I say. And then they don't have to think about it at that point because they've already thought about it. It's already there for them. And there's lots of different ways in which people can utilise that, writing positive messages to themselves, or other people writing positive messages for them to have in that emergency box. There's loads of different ways of doing it. A person to look at is Carolyn Spring. So she has an example of an emergency box, which has some really good kind of resources in as well. So I'd recommend having a look at her stuff. Okay, so that's pretty much all from me. I'm just going to leave you guys with some good practice. First and foremost, as I've already kind of alluded to, is to believe survivors. If someone discloses sexual violence and abuse to you, you should believe what they're saying. Secondly, to offer support and empathy, listen to their needs, but not to ask invasive questions if that's not part of your role. People should have autonomy over their own stories and they shouldn't have to tell you everything if that's not vital information that you need to know in order for you to be able to do your job. Understand and acknowledge the impact of trauma. Know your local support services and signpost survivors to specialist support if that's what they want. Challenge rape myths and victim blaming attitudes and language, and also be aware of the importance of language and how that can kind of come across as victim blaming at times. So I've got a list here of regional support services, specialist support services for sexual violence. In the handout that I'm going to send, that Rachel is going to send out with the evaluation, I'll obviously put the contact numbers and stuff on there as well. So yeah, I think that is pretty much everything from me.